Even though these are private players which are selling, they cannot actually raise the price at will. There has to be a kind of consultation with the government in raising the price. So the strike was against the government's allowing this company to raise price. Everything is rooted through the government. The government is the great mediator in such a situation.
And I mean, even if you were in a motorcycle, probably you would be attacked as breaking the strike.
Yeah, sure.
So it completely.
Because even one motorcycle on the street will signify that the strikers were weak enough so that people could do this, or there were not enough support for the strikers. So it has to be visibly complete. So every strike action has to be visibly complete.
This was fascinating insights. Would an implication of this be, say, in standard economics, we would say the government should not be regulating the price of oil, of gasoline. But given the social attitudes in India, that it would probably be a mistake anytime soon for economists to come in and say you should just deregulate.
Precisely. You are absolutely right, because Indian deregulation, which started from the early 90s, it has not been the way classical deregulation takes place. Even now, Indian government faces stiff opposition if it tries to deregularize public sector units. And on the top of that, the government has to take up a number of populist welfare measures in order to respond to crisis situations. Like just before the elections in last year's parliamentary election, the Congress government, the United Progressive Alliance government, which is led by the Congress, it decided to waive all farmers' loans. And that ran into thousands of crores, billions of dollars, but they were waived. Because this was a way to give a message to the people on the ground that, look, we think about you. But by economic rationality, this is a huge pressure on the state.
So given that sort of, how does one sort of calculate where you can push to get more economic reforms? Because it's clear over the long term, I think, to raise standards of living, one is going to need to reform some.
Yeah, I want part of an answer for
that. And then you can tell us whether he's right.
Okay, I sat across the table from Manmohan Singh before he was Prime Minister. He's an economist, he's a good economist. He was going to talk about Indian economy, Indian economic policy. In the entire talk, he never talked about the idea of creating wealth, of raising GNP, raising GDP, whatever. Everything he spoke to were issues of income distribution, the poor, helping the poor. The framing of policy had to be in terms of those sorts of ideas and concepts. And he was apparently very successful somehow in getting the policies that he began in '91 going. And then basically sustaining them to some extent. And of course, those who don't succeed, as in Andhra, the chief minister there, the technology chief minister, gets voted out of office.
Absolutely.
Successful economic growth.
Yeah. I'll give another example from West Bengal recently. There was this protest by the farmers against acquisition of land, agricultural land, in two places. And these two places were to get a huge investment by private corporate bodies. One of them actually got the investment. You would have known about this nano car which Tata is producing. So one of the sites were meant for the production facilities of this nano car, which would have created enormous amount of job in the neighborhood as well as in the state as well. But the farmers' protests did not allow any of these things to materialize. And now, because the left government in the state supported these ventures, it's likely to lose in the next election. So social justice, distributive justice, that remains the central point in India's economic thinking. So I'm not surprised that Manmohan Singh would be I mean, irrespective of his ideological position, at least in rhetoric, he cannot depart from the principles of distribution. And it's a very tricky kind of situation now, because the vast majority of the people, they are not getting the benefits, and that's for sure, they are not. A very thin layer are getting super rich in the new economy. In the cities, you have regions which are demarcated, not in Calcutta so much, but in Delhi and increasingly in Bombay. Because of the Commonwealth Games, Delhi is actually demolishing slums, which happened during the emergency in 1975 and happening again. So, you know, there is a concerted effort on the part of a certain section which run the state to get rid of the poor, at least from the visible vicinity. So the resistance to such is also extremely vehement. And that doesn't also, I mean, follow the logic of economic rationality. So it's a very complex situation, and I suppose that gives, you know, if it were an authoritarian state, none of these would have mattered. You know, people wouldn't have even known that there were some protests somewhere in the remote villages and 14 people died as a result of police firing. This wouldn't have created any stir at all. And of course, I mean, we know that in China there are such things happening, but they're not reported, they're not news. So this is... Sorry?
80,000 demonstrations of over 100 people in the last year. And the Chinese have been forced, against their will, the party, CPC, to allow these things to be unseen and revealed. It's become much more difficult, I think, for society that wants to have some openness to the world economy, as China does, to really keep things closed as they always used to.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's calibrated opening. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if there is calibrated opening, but on the whole, an authoritarian state can manage to some extent much better than democracy, where you have got to respond instead of the managerial way of looking at how to, I mean, sort of develop a relationship with the population. You've got to think about alternative ways. And I think that in the long run, it will give rise to alternative ideas of development. And it is already doing so.
Let me ask, just following on the China comment, that Western press is fascinated with sort of China versus India and birth rate. How much is that seen as an issue within India, I guess both in the social elite and I assume not much with the poor?
I don't think that, you know, in India, for instance, it's well known that there's no competition in the sense that in terms of economic growth, China is way ahead. But what is being talked about all the time is refining the institutions of democracy. So certain things can be done within the society, you know. One could think about both growth and distribution simultaneously. That's the ideal of the economic reform. You know, that one could really think about both at the same time. And as a result, a certain kind of engagement with institutional practices taking place. For instance, immediately after the launching of the new economy in the 1990s, as Manmohan Singh, when he was the finance minister, India went for a rapid decentralization of the polity. So you've got village-level governments, at the lowest level now and all over the country. Of course, I mean, they operate much better in some states than other states. Like in Kerala, Bengal, Karnataka, they operate really well. But in many other states like Northern India, UP, some of these caste states, they don't. But still, the kind of new political structure which was conceived and implemented as a law, you know, these are the kind of refinements of public policy. Like, for instance, another thing I just quickly mentioned about the kind of displacement which is taking place because of the construction of dams or factories or special economic zones. So the government is constantly bothered to think about popularly acceptable compensations, you know. So every time you engage in a dialogue with the potentially affected population, you've got to come up with new ideas which would be acceptable. So these are the innovative institutional practices which I